It all started with a glossy flyer that showed up in my mailbox one Tuesday morning. At first glance, it looked like one of those generic community updates the HOA sends out every couple of months, the kind you skim and toss in the recycling bin. But as I flipped through the pages, my eyes caught a bold headline announcing, "Exciting new development! Luxury lakefront cabins coming soon." Below it was a series of computer-generated renderings showing neatly lined rows of shiny wooden cabins stretching along what was clearly my lakefront. I thought maybe I was imagining it, so I held the flyer closer, tracing the shoreline in the picture with my finger. There was no mistaking it. The sandy curve, the little dock I'd built myself years ago, even the old oak tree that leaned just enough to cast shade on the water in the late afternoon. This wasn't some vague plan for another part of the neighborhood. This was my property. The more I read, the more absurd it became. The HOA proudly declared they would enhance the community's recreational appeal by constructing 120 high-end cabins for premium seasonal rental opportunities. They talked about projected revenue streams, community prestige, and the supposed benefit of greater tourism appeal. Nowhere in the flyer did it mention a land purchase, a lease agreement, or even an attempt to contact the property owner, me. It was as if they had decided ownership was just a minor detail they could figure out later. I could almost hear the smug voices in the boardroom saying, "We're the HOA, we can make it happen." What really got me wasn't just the audacity of it all, but the tone they used in their announcement. They wrote as though this was already a done deal, something that had been approved unanimously by every relevant party. They included a construction start date, a rough timeline for completion, and even a reservation pre-registration link for anyone interested in booking a cabin once they were built. Reading it felt surreal, like I had been dropped into some bureaucratic fever dream where property lines didn't matter, and someone else could just declare a new use for my land without so much as a knock on my door. I sat there staring at the flyer, still in disbelief that they had the nerve to map out my shoreline like it was just another blank space on their planning sheet, completely ignoring the fact that it wasn't theirs to take or use. After reading that flyer, the first thing I did was check my phone for any missed calls or emails from the HOA. Nothing. No formal letter, no meeting request, not even a neighborly heads-up. They hadn't spoken to me at all about their so-called luxury cabin project. It was as if they decided my presence and my ownership were irrelevant details that could be quietly brushed aside. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that this wasn't some oversight or simple mistake. This was a deliberate move to act without my consent, to bulldoze through the process before I could object. In most situations involving shared spaces or community changes, there's at least an attempt at diplomacy. You get invited to a meeting, maybe hear out a sales pitch about mutual benefits or shared vision. But here? Nothing. They didn't even bother with the fake politeness some HOAs use to soften the blow of their overreach. It was as if the decision had already been made, and my land was just a checkbox on their project list waiting to be marked. Cleared. I started asking around, speaking to a few neighbors who were also on the lake. That's when I learned that the HOA had been quietly holding informational sessions for selected residents, carefully chosen people who wouldn't raise too many questions. These meetings painted the project as a community win, something everyone should be proud of. And in those rooms, they used my lakefront property as the flagship selling point, showing the same renderings I'd seen in the flyer, talking about how beautiful this stretch of shoreline would look once their cabins were in place. Not once did they clarify that it wasn't theirs to build on. The more I dug into it, the more obvious it became that they were banking on speed and intimidation. If they could get contractors mobilized and construction underway quickly enough, they figured I'd either be forced to accept it or be too overwhelmed by legal costs to fight them. It was a classic power play. Skip the permission, move fast, and let the paperwork catch up later. But what they didn't seem to realize was that I wasn't just some passive homeowner who would roll over when they pushed. The complete absence of any attempt to consult me wasn't just disrespectful. It was the first clear sign that they believed they could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, without having to answer to anyone. Within a week of that flyer making the rounds, the quiet lakefront I'd known for years transformed into something that looked more like a construction staging ground. Early in the morning, before the sun even broke over the water, the rumble of heavy equipment echoed across the shoreline. Trucks rolled and loaded with lumber, pallets of concrete blocks, and stacks of shiny new roofing materials. It was jarring to see, not just because it happened so suddenly, but because it was happening without a single piece of authorization from me. They hadn't bought the land, hadn't leased it, hadn't even negotiated a temporary right-of-way. They simply showed up as if it were already theirs. The crews worked fast, setting up temporary fencing and marking the ground with spray paint. Bright orange lines zigzagged across my property, cutting through spaces where I'd fished with friends, hosted summer cookouts, and watched sunsets from my dock. In less than 48 hours, they had portable offices parked near the shoreline, and a team of surveyors walking around with clipboards and laser measuring tools, plotting exactly where the cabins would go. The sheer confidence they had while trespassing was almost more insulting than the act itself. Everywhere I looked, there was some sign of their progress. Piles of timber sat just feet from the waterline, and large cement tubes were stacked like building blocks waiting to be put into place. Workers spoke loudly about timelines and delivery schedules, completely unfazed by the fact that the site they were talking about was my private property. Even the HOA board members made occasional appearances, strolling through the mess in their branded polos, nodding approvingly as if they were overseeing their rightful domain. I tried speaking to one of the foremen, asking who had authorized this project. His answer was vague, referring me back to the board, and insisting they had all the paperwork in place. But when I pressed for details, permits, land agreements, anything tangible, he got defensive, repeating that everything was handled, and that I should talk to the HOA directly. It was clear they'd been instructed not to question the job, and to keep moving no matter what. By the third day, the sound of hammering and drilling was constant, and the once clear lake breeze now carried the smell of diesel fuel and freshly cut lumber. My dock, my trees, my open view of the water, every bit of it was being swallowed up by their project, as if my history with this place didn't matter at all. After watching them take over my shoreline without a shred of hesitation, I decided it was time to revisit some paperwork I hadn't looked at in years. Late one evening, I dug through an old metal filing cabinet in my study, pulling out the thick folder that held every deed, plat map, and legal document tied to my property. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for: a yellowed envelope containing the original purchase agreement and a separate set of documents related to the dam at the far end of the lake. I remembered the day I bought it, how the real estate agent had mentioned it almost as an afterthought, saying, "Oh, and the dam is included in the sale. Not many people can say they own one of those." At the time, it had seemed like a quirky little bonus. Now, it was starting to look like the most valuable piece of leverage I had. I spread the documents out on my desk and went over them carefully. The property lines were crystal clear, showing my ownership stretching from my house all the way to the shoreline, including the dock area they were now building over. But the real gem was the separate deed for the dam, a structure that, according to both the purchase record and the water rights agreement, I owned outright. It wasn't just a chunk of concrete holding back water. It was the control point for the entire lake's water level. Without that dam, the lake would slowly but surely drain away. The HOA had made a massive oversight. In their rush to claim my lakefront, they had never bothered to verify who controlled the most critical piece of the lake's infrastructure. They were so focused on selling cabin reservations and laying out construction plans that they hadn't realized their prime waterfront was dependent on a structure they had no. The dam sat at the far end of the lake, a sturdy concrete structure with a weather-controlled gate tucked away behind a padlocked access fence. Most people in the neighborhood didn't even know it could be operated manually. They assumed it was just some old relic the county maintained. But I had the key, and I knew exactly how it worked. Standing there, I could hear the faint rush of water spilling through the spillway, a steady hum that had been part of the lake's soundtrack for decades. All it would take was turning the gate wheel, slowly at first, and the lake's water level would begin to drop inch by inch. As I inspected the gate mechanism, I thought about the scene unfolding on the opposite shore. The HOA's crews hammering and sawing, the board members checking off progress on their clipboards, the half-built frames of those cabins standing proudly just a few feet from the water's edge. They had planned everything around the assumption that the lake would stay exactly where it was, calm, full, picturesque. The idea that the shoreline could shrink or the water could vanish entirely probably never crossed their minds. I ran through the logistics in my head. Opening the dam wouldn't cause a sudden flood. It would be a gradual, steady release, lowering the water level over several days. To the untrained eye, it might even seem like a natural seasonal shift. But for cabins built so close to the edge, even a drop of a couple of feet would turn their prime waterfront into a muddy stretch of exposed lakebed. And if I let it keep draining, well, they'd be left staring at dry ground where their million-dollar view used to be. I checked the maintenance log stored in this small metal box near the gate. The last entry was from years ago, signed by the previous owner, confirming that everything was in good working order. My ownership of the dam gave me full discretion over water management, and no HOA approval was required. The more I stood there, the more I realized that this quiet, overlooked structure held all the power. It didn't matter how many cabins they built or how much money they'd already sunk into the project. Without the lake, they had nothing. By the time the water level had dropped enough to be noticeable, the change was impossible for the HOA to ignore. What had once been a sparkling expanse of blue stretching right up to their freshly built decks was now retreating further each day, leaving behind a wide band of wet, dark mud. The lake's gentle waves no longer lapped against the cabin pilings. Instead, they ended several feet away, exposing tangled roots, scattered rocks, and bits of driftwood that had been hidden underwater for years. The glossy promotional images they'd shown off, the ones with canoes bobbing at the shoreline and kids splashing in the shallows, were already impossible to recreate. Construction workers began to look uneasy. Some of them stood at the edge of the receding water during breaks, hands on hips, staring as if trying to figure out what was happening. Piles of materials meant for boat docks and shoreline landscaping sat unused, and the half-built pier, it was subtle at first, but with each passing day, it grew stronger, especially in the heat of the afternoon sun. The pristine image of luxury lakefront living they had been selling to potential renters was quickly unraveling into something more like a cautionary tale. Some of the cabins had been positioned so close to the waterline that their foundations now looked awkward and overextended, sitting on dry, cracked ground instead of gently sloping into the lake. The whole scene had a strange, almost eerie quality, rows of expensive new structures standing proud, but with their main attraction quite literally slipping away before everyone's eyes. Workers shifted focus to interior framing and roofing, clearly trying to push forward with what they could, but the energy on the site had changed. The sound of construction was no longer accompanied by upbeat conversation or confident laughter. It was quieter now, tense, with an unspoken acknowledgement hanging in the air that the lake, and the view that justified this entire project, was disappearing.